Hi everybody, welcome back to the Excel podcast. Today we are going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is entrepreneurship, building businesses, scaling businesses up, potential exits. We're going to talk about that for those of you out there who are in the process of setting up a business, or a lot of you who are growing a business, maybe facing some challenges yourself. How do I scale this business? What should I be thinking about? Because often we're so busy building the business, we don't think about the next stage. So really, we need a better framework to understand it. We need a bit of advice. So I'm joined today by author and podcast host, Kevin Brent from BizSmart. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Graham. It's, delighted to be here. Thank you very much.
Well, we're on point with favorite subject. I can talk about entrepreneurship for days because everybody's got an opinion as well. And we've all got experiences, I guess, of entrepreneurship. Myself, I haven't picked up a regular paycheck from a corporate for over 20 years. So I know what it's like to build businesses and be in that zone. Not everybody has been, in business for so long, but increasingly, I suppose more people are starting businesses. People are leaving the corporate world and starting business. The corporate dropout is a thing now. Yeah. The startup is, a regular feature of the business environment now. And what about yourself, Kevin? Would you describe yourself as an entrepreneur or a consultant? What's your background?
Yeah, I think I'd describe myself as an entrepreneur. I've had the usual corporate background beforehand and the MBA, all of those good things. But I remember right back at school and certainly at university, my goal was to run my own business and have a successful business. But it took me a while to get around to actually doing it.
Yeah, there is a real case, isn't there, for going into the world of business, the corporate world, learning the rules, if you like, and getting a bit of experience. Get them to bankroll your education and then go out and start your own business. That seems to be much more of a thing these days, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And you can be entrepreneurial within a business. You don't, to be an entrepreneur, fine, but you can be an entrepreneurial corporate employee as well.
Yes, exactly. And that is obviously a big growth area as well. Hey, tell me something, Kevin. I noticed you did 5 years in the Royal Air Force, sorry.
Indeed.
As an officer. I'm curious, what does an officer or what does a pilot know about flying that the average person doesn't know, or importantly thinks they know?
About flying?
Yes.
Well, I guess depending on whether the average person knows how to fly or not.
Assume not. I'm sure they're an armchair pilot.
Yeah, we probably all got the image of Tom Cruise and Maverick with Top Gun. I would imagine.
Exactly, especially now.
And yeah, well, and I don't know about you, but I remember watching that. I was at university on the Air Squadron when the original came out, and I think most of us on that were being there sponsored by the RAF through university at that point. I think most of us watched Top Gun about 7 times.
Fabulous. It was good PR for your personal brand, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious about how you think about, what the pilots, their sort of approach to the problem, if you like, of flying. What sort of training do they give you? And I'm curious because obviously this is going to bridge a bit into the world of business. But what are the sort of things that a pilot would get taught that your average person wouldn't ever know?
Yeah, so I suspect if we do have the image of Top Gun in our mind, we just have this image of somebody that's naturally brilliant at flying and very, well, gash is a kind of old RAF term in a way where you just do what you think is the right thing and just off the cuff sort of stuff. Well, of course, it's not like that at all. And flying any kind of airplane from whatever level, whether you're in the Air Force or not, is all around systems and procedures, and in particular checklists. So you have a checklist for absolutely everything, whether that be for even before you get to the aircraft, but then your walk around checks, your pre-flight checks, and you've got checks for each different stages of the aircraft of when you're in flight, but obviously for different types of emergencies. And I guess that's one of the things. It is interesting that you raise that because it's one of the things that we brought into the business side and believe very strongly about, is that these checklists are not about then restricting your thinking to just doing what's on a checklist. It's actually a liberating thing, because if you know when you've got an engine fire exactly what you're going to do and you just flick through those things, you don't have to devote any real brain power to it. can focus all of your brain power in how do I get this airplane down safely. So you've done all the checks to shut down the engine and make sure that the fire doesn't spread, automatically made all the right radio calls, and you can focus all of your attention then on what you might, from a business perspective, would say were the more important, more creative things that you're then doing. So it's actually having checklists and things is actually really liberating. So you're not just fumbling going, hang on, I think I should do that next, and then this, and before you know it, you've run into the side of a mountain or something like that.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm fascinated by that, because it's kind of the way we approach business in a way is, there's a lot of talk about, find your passion, and very much it's an important part of being committed and growing any business. But we tend to think that it's all kind of intuitive, don't we? That, and there is a bit of the media bias there about, we hear stories about these great business founders and owners, people like the Steve Jobses, who just had this creative brilliance. And it's almost as if, you can't imagine that guy ever having a checklist. You can't imagine that guy ever having a dashboard or, a spreadsheet in front of him. And therefore it's all sort of done very much on right brain thinking. And yet I imagine for most business owners, the actual reality, the day-to-day of a business is that they face challenges which can completely derail the business and take away that sort of creative stuff. It could be cash flow, it could be payment terms with a client, and so on. So I think there's a real case for reestablishing the importance for data, dashboards, procedures, checklists, and so on, not in sort of a way of policing ourselves as business owners, because that's kind of what we've left behind in the corporate world, isn't it? But to kind of free our lizard brain, that sort of monkey brain, away from sort of worrying about things. And just in a very short summary of that, I can think, for example, in my own personal business, is that simply having a better view, and this is kind of like your cockpit, I suppose, of cash flow in a business, can take away that constant internal chatter about how much money do we have in the business. And small things like that can liberate you completely.
Exactly, because they're always on your mind, you're worrying about them. Whereas if you can actually know that they're under control, because the things that really make us stress are when we feel we're out of control. They're the things that worry us, and I'm sure if we talk to anybody that's in the medical field and looking at anxiety and things like that, it's all about, because we're worrying about things and things are out of control. Whereas if we can start to get control of even small elements of it, we know we're doing something about it, and that gives us that sense of not only the control, but it reduces that anxiety to a certain level. And yes, I think many of us, when we start our own businesses, we've got all this imagination about what kind of business we're going to create and what it's going to be like, and we've thrown the boss away. We've no longer got somebody that we're accountable to, and we can do what we want, and we're going to create this wonderful business that will give us this wonderful lifestyle that we're in control of completely, and give us the freedom that we want to do whatever we want to do. And most of us struggle to get there. We realize after a short period of time, and it's probably a couple of years typically, that actually, okay, this gig isn't quite as easy as we thought it was going to be.
The reality.
And that's when we have to combine. And I think true success within business comes from a combination of that passion in doing something that you really want to achieve, and your vision as to where you want to get to. But there has to be that element of discipline within it as well, for our self-discipline, because we've got to create the kind of business that isn't reliant on us. We can't do everything. You mentioned Steve Jobs, but he wasn't doing everything within Apple. He had to create a business that other people bought into, and then whether he was into checklists or not, he had to create some systems where other people knew what they were supposed to be doing and had bought into it, and really, hopefully is almost as passionate as him to help drive the business. Because at the end of the day, it's and there's lots of quotes around it, but essentially, it's the systems that drive a business, but it's the people that drive those systems. So if you don't create the systems in the first place, you're never going to scale beyond a certain point.
Excellent advice. Well, let's talk about those systems. Let's talk about the individual systems and also the meta system, the ScaleUp system that you need to build. as a business owner. Let's talk about what we'll talk about then, how to scale, the difference between good growth and bad growth. If that's a new conversation for you as the listener, then that's an important conversation to take on board. Not all growth is good growth, right? There are instances of bad growth. I'm sure we'll talk about them. It's not all about the exits. It's about scale, and
Yes.
really this is about options, isn't it? Building for value, achieving a favorable exit. Again, there are good exits and bad exits. I can testify to that personally as well.
Right. Yeah.
Before we get there, some data from your book about scale. 96% of businesses never reach 10 plus employees. This kind of arcs back to your point about, we start off thinking we're going to grow this game-changing business, and then the rubber hits the road. As they say in the military, no plan ever survives first contact with the enemy. The enemy being the market, competition. A lot of things can happen, the winds of circumstance. And before we get that, I'm very curious. I know you're a fan of John Warrilow.
Yes.
We'll mention him as well, coming up in a minute. We talked as well before this call about Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. There's something from his book that says that, I don't know if it's true, you're a pilot, you would know this, 95% of our time flying a plane, I don't know if he's got any experience, we're off course, we're constantly recalibrating. I don't know if that is a true fact, but it seems to me that is the nature of business. So there's a lot of info that I've kind of dumped on the table there for the listener and for you, Kevin. But let's start this idea of 96% of businesses never reach 10 plus employees. That's a bit of a shock, isn't it? We thought you would get there eventually, but
that was the stat that really I kind of I guess inspired me to set up Bismart and to start looking into it a bit more, because coming from a corporate environment and with the RF originally, and then a corporate environment, you kind of think, well, there's all these really successful businesses out there, because that's what you hear about. You hear about the gazelles, you hear about the wonderful businesses, the huge businesses, and then when you actually look at it, you realize, and it's actually even more stark than that number. If you look at businesses with more than 50 employees, it's only 0.7% of businesses. Certainly in the UK, and I'm pretty sure these statistics are similar worldwide, only about less than 1% scale beyond 50 employees. So we've got all these images of these huge companies, but actually they make up the minority in terms of the number of companies. So yes, so 99% are less than 50 and 96% less than 10. And that's what we really set out, and certainly I set out to really understand why that might be. Is it because most of them don't want to? Or is there something else going on here that is preventing people? Because my starting point was, well, I'm starting a business. I've started a few businesses. My aim is to create a reasonably not large just for the sake of being large, but I'm envisaging having a good number of employees and all of those things. So maybe other people are like that. So why isn't that translating into the numbers?
What's the number one reason? I know there's probably a number of reasons, but at the top of the list.
I think there are a number of reasons, and I do think it comes down. I think we sort of bring it down to a couple of key things, and it does come down to an understanding of what it takes to scale, and this difference between scaling and you mentioned good and bad growth, if you like, comes down to an understanding of that. So we've got that in our mind, but then we've got to have, whether we call it the discipline or processes, but actually habits is a really good word for it. It's habits. And if we go back to the flying, we get into really good habits. And you mentioned whether we're off course a lot of the time, but every 5 minutes, typically, even in civilian aircraft, at least every 5 minutes, you've got a series of checks that you would do. In fact, and I still remember the acronym for that now, and for some of the other, that was a field check, which sounds great. FEEL. So fuel, engine, electrics, and location. So
was that done manually?
That was a manual check, yes. So
right.
you what you were checking with the fuel, so you'd be checking the fuel gauge, and have we got enough to get to the destination. You'd be checking all your electrics, so all of any warning lights that might be out. You got some engine display lights as well that you'd be looking at, and then you do what you were just saying about the location. Are we still on track? So you'd have a couple of checkpoints that you'd be looking for. Are we still on track for that? And is our heading still correct? So you'd be doing those constant little checks, as well as then having specific other checks for different stages of the flight. So it's those habits that we get into as a business. So combined with an understanding of the idea of scaling up with the good habits within the business, that's what needs to come. So it's all very well having this wonderful vision about what we're going to be in the future, but if we don't create those good habits in the meantime and understand how we need to create a business that will be able to scale, that we're not just going to be the bottleneck to everything within that business. Understanding how to do that's what's really important, because otherwise what happens, and there's I hate to bring up loads of stats, it sounds like a statistician sort of lesson here, but we talk about those 96%. But the UK, for example, is something like third for startups in Europe, in terms of the number of startups, and about 13th for scale-ups. So something is going wrong more in the UK perhaps than in other parts of Europe, where we're getting lots of businesses starting up, but then they're failing. That's not necessarily, lots of businesses do fail, but actually also a lot of businesses just get stuck at a certain point. So it's coming back to unlocking that as to why that might be, and then putting in place those good habits to do that.
I like this idea. I like that field check as well. And that the fact that it's an acronym is memorable, isn't it? It's not requiring a lot of overhead. And that's been drilled into you, I'm sure. When you, if you're with a trainer and you 10 minutes had passed, he'll be rapping you on the knuckles with a wooden ruler, right?
Yeah, my downwind checks were bump fitch.
Getting technical.
Yeah, brakes, undercarriage, mixture. So you just these things lock in your mind. But the point is, again, it's the habit that you're going to do them for the first bit. So it's that rhythm, and we talk a lot about business rhythm. But then it's that you can just tick them off. You haven't got to get out, and this is a difference, I think, between civilian flying, if you just get your private pilot's license and you do a little bit of light aircraft flying, versus flying in the military. And I'm sure also, there's different with airline flying as well, which I'll cover maybe in a second. But the difference is that in the military, certainly you're expected to know all these things absolutely off pat. So you spend hours and hours just in if I say a simulator, it's going to sound very grand, but I spent hours in a cardboard cutout, right? It's a chair, an ordinary chair with a cardboard cutout of the cockpit in front of you, learning these checks. So it's not some grand electronic simulator, but you learn it, so you've got them off rote. Whereas in the early days of certainly private pilot's license flying, you have your checklist and you flick to the right bit and you go, which is okay, but it's not as good as if you just know them off by heart. Within the airline industry, certainly you've got a co-pilot with you, and it's often the co-pilot that actually is then reading out the check and the pilot then affirming that action. So you've actually got that second pair of eyes, which is also another nuance on the idea of the checklist. So you've got somebody else so you're not just doing it by rote and saying the word, but not actually really noticing whether it's correct or not. Yeah,
that's the importance as well in business of the second pair of eyes, isn't it?
Yeah.
Blind spots.
And that's even if you're so if we get into a good rhythm within business, and I think this is probably getting to the heart of much of why businesses get to a certain point and then don't proceed beyond it, is they don't have a good rhythm in place. And when I say rhythm, it's around these habits. So like the flying, if we know every 5 minutes we're going to do a field check, right? Well, we talk a lot about a 90-day cycle in business. So it's great to have this 10-year, as Jim Collins would say, your big, hairy, audacious goal, your BHAG, 10 or 30 year goal. It's great to have that, but we've got to break that down backwards, and then we've got to, and then quarter by quarter, we want to pick on the key things that we're going to do, the things we must achieve in the next 90 days. And in 90 days time, we need to have the habit in place that we're going to stop and check whether how we did against those and what we're going to do for the next 90 days. But of course, in between, we don't just wait 90 days and see whether we've done it. In between, we need a rhythm to support that 90-day planning. So what's our weekly and our monthly and even our daily rhythm that means that we're keeping the plate spinning, but also we're addressing some of the things in the longer term that we need to do. Because if all we're doing, and this is the trap that a lot of us fall into, is we're trying to keep those plates spinning. We start up with all these great ideas, we get a few clients, we get busy, and before we know it, we're in that cycle of where we've got to keep that plate spinning, and then we run to the next keep plate spinning, and whatever. We don't want the plates to drop, and we got no thought about then putting another pole and another plate and moving forward, because we can't cope with the plates that we've got spinning.
I love it. It's almost like you've been sitting in my meetings for the last 20 years, Kevin. Especially the spinning plates. My team would tell you that the number of times I've used that analogy. And I remember the first time I used it, they give me that look like, what is he going on about, spinning plates? But that's the exact feeling that I have about it as a startup business owner. And the language you're using, I'm sure a lot of people have felt this as well. I'm very, very curious about this rhythm. I like this idea. I want to sort of explore it a bit more. To get there, I want to share with you a bit about my experience as an entrepreneur, because then I can share with you what I've learned the hard way. And that is, 20 years as an entrepreneur, first business, forget it. It was started with a friend. So let's write that one off. Okay. Then the second business was successful. It did really well. We had a very cash generative business, and it was in a market which was expanding very fast. So we were in the right place, right time, very lucky, caught the wave, and grew very fast. And then, we went well beyond 10 employees, went to 35 employees. Right. Now, the mistake that I made was checks, none. It was, occasionally look at the bank account. Whoa, that looks nice. And then, that's even better. And then one day I had a visit from a bank manager. Bank managers never visit clients, right, or customers. Turns up one day and he said, I want to find out what's going on in your business. You're making a lot of money. It's like, okay, I like the attention, but obviously
that is when they turn up.
Yeah, exactly. Not when I'm asking for money. It's like he came around, he bought me a cup of coffee and everything. It's like I felt very royal. So that was the situation. Then, embedded in that business were a lot of problems that were not being checked out, in that field check, if you like, that maybe it looked good, but what was hidden in that was, maybe bad payment terms, maybe a lot of hidden costs that were sort of mounting up. Now, fast forward to now, the one thing I do, if you look at, if I could kind of concertina my 20 years, it's what I've learned is, and what I teach myself going back, and I've learned this through 20 years of mistakes, and that's very expensive. I don't have your book, for example. I didn't have your book. Is basically every day now I have a checklist of I think there's about 12 items, and I go through. One of them is look at the bank account, start with the basics, go into zero, check my profit and loss, make sure it's being updated, make sure, there's not 6 months of unreconciled items in there, right? So there's a lot of hiddens. And then, basically you can get the idea, leads, et cetera, et cetera. You can go all the way through the business. I'm a business owner listening to you now, Kevin. I don't have 20 years to find out the answers. So let's accelerate the whole thing. A bit of experience from your book and your journey as well, and what you've learned speaking to startup founders and business owners. What should I be doing on a daily basis when it comes to rhythm? What does that actually look like?
Yeah, so I think the thing that you can do straight away, without getting into too much complexity of anything, is to put in place, first of all, every 90 days, at least half a day, when you block in your diary, when you're going to sit down with your team, if you've got a team, or if you haven't got a team, even if you're on your own, you sit down, ideally with somebody else that you trust, because it is better definitely to do it with somebody else. And you literally put in place this in your calendar every 90 days, and you stick to it. And in that session, in that time, you ask yourself, what went well over the last 90 days? What didn't go so well? What's come up in those 90 days that we didn't realize before? And what does good look like for the end of the next 90 days? Right. And if all you do is that, I mean, that takes you to about page 2 in the book. But if all you do in that is that's a start, because most of us don't do that. Most of us have this, maybe some long-term idea we're going to get to. We might, if we're lucky, and I know most business owners don't do this, we might think year on year, what are we going to do this next year? but then we just do whatever happens in the intervening period, and we either get there or we don't, and normally we don't. So every 90 days, just do that. Sit down and really think about it. And then the other thing that I would suggest alongside that is to say, right, let's have a weekly check of some sort, and let's work out what that weekly rhythm is. That means that we're not just going for 90 days and then seeing whether or not we got to where we want to get to at the end of it. But each week we're doing a little bit of a check, and that check in that week, because I'll bet that the vast majority of the business owners that are listening to this, certainly those that have been in business for a couple of years or more, have a business rhythm, and they probably have a weekly meeting within that. But I'll also bet that most of that meeting is about keeping the plate spinning. And so it's, this client's got an issue, we need to deal with that, or this is happening. What do we do with it? There's probably hardly anything which is like, hang on a minute, we said we'd build this kind of business, and we haven't done anything to address that. Right. So that's what needs to come in from the 90-day. Where do we want to be in the next 90 days? What does good look like? That's what needs to come into that weekly rhythm, is to, are we making progress check against that? So to start with, if all you do is that, then you'll do probably a lot more than what most business owners are doing, because you're combining again, to use some of Stephen Covey's language, you're combining the important and the urgent in the right sort of mix. You're not just doing all the urgent things, you're also bringing some of the important things that maybe they're not urgent. The business wouldn't stop, the plates wouldn't drop straight away if you didn't do that right now. But equally, if you don't start to address it, you're never going to be able to grow more plates or more poles with plates on them. So that, I think, is a key thing. And there's you could spend certainly within the book we explore that a bit further, but also we bring in other things about understanding how the scale up journey and the kind of things we need to consider. We also then bring in, we have what we call our in-flight checks. Going back to the flying, we call them our in-flight checks, which we bring in every 90 days with the people that we work with, and we do that within our business. And that gives us like that field check. It's like that engine, fuel electric engine location check. We look at 4 key areas of the business: strategy, people, execution, and cash. And we break those down into subsections and checks. And it's like, okay, how are we doing against those? Not with a view of going, well, there's 123 things or something that we need to focus on. It's like, okay, which is the one light, the one warning light that's really on, that actually, that's gonna take us out of the air if we're not careful. Or equally, it's the one thing that if we, to turn it the other way around, if we focused on that one thing, would make the biggest improvement in the business. Right, well, let's pick that, and that becomes something we build into our 90 days. So we've got that constant view as to business improvement around the things we know will help to build a scalable and resilient business ongoing. So, but as I say, if you start with it just being really simple, that's great. Ideally, what we're doing also is we're saying, where are we headed in the future? So going back again to the idea of the stretch goal or the big, hairy, audacious goal, where are we trying to get to? And let's bring 1 or 2 of those things in as well. But if we simply every 90 days look at what went well, what didn't go so well, what else have we learned, and therefore what does good look like in it?
I like this question. What does good look like? I'm curious to unpack that a little bit. What would that be? Would it be measurable data points? This is what our sales are. We've done £100,000 in sales in 90 days. Or is it more qualitative stuff? For example, like, I want to take a week holiday, for the first time in X number of years as a business owner. Or is it sort of the more, the stuff that you can't actually measure in binary terms? What typically constitutes a good answer to that question? Because I'm sure, business owners are saying, well, I could talk about a lot of different things when you say, what does good look like here? Because, you can just focus on the numbers here, but then you can focus on the qualitative stuff, which isn't measurable. And therefore, potentially you can't hold yourself accountable to.
I think it's not all about the numbers, and I think that's a really interesting point. Is bringing in the more qualitative things, and perhaps the more personal things. Exactly, as you've said, and we bring into that. So within that 90-day, those priorities. So I mean, we are getting a little bit into the the detail of what we do here. So we would say what you're doing is if you've got a team of people, you're working together to identify those key 90-day priorities that the business must achieve. But then to get this accountability thing coming in, because, as we said earlier, one of the great things about being a business owner is you're not accountable to a boss anymore, right? But also that's one of the biggest problems of being a business owner, right? So we've got those priorities. Let's now break those down into for the individuals. So, it might be that if we're running the business together, it might be that fine. This is the priority the priorities that we've got. Graham, these are your rocks, if you like. And we're using Stephen Covey language here with rocks, pebbles, and sand, which many of the listeners will be familiar with. But these are your rocks. These are your must achieves, or we agree that these are mine. And they cut and make sure that we're not missing anything of those business priorities, but then also you and I are breaking those down into actions then that we need to do, as well as bringing one or two other things that we might want to do, and that's where the personal stuff comes in. So you might have, and we look at something called a balance wheel to make sure that that we're addressing all aspects of our lives, actually, not just business lives, but are there some personal things as well that we might want to bring in there? Because increasingly the idea of a separation between business and personal life is hard and harder to, it just doesn't exist like that. They encroach on each other. So we've got to bring those things in. But, without getting too much detail, which is difficult for the listeners maybe on a podcast, it's that idea of having clear business priorities that we've agreed as a team and limiting ourselves to between 5 and 7, no more than 7. Because if we say, there's all these 106 different things, they're not priorities anymore. They're not real priorities. So it forces us to think, okay, let's bring these down to the top 5 things. If we did nothing else this quarter other than keep a few plates spinning, and we did these 5 extra really, really strong things that must be addressed, are we going to be happy with that 90 days? Right. If there's other things that they're not so urgent, then maybe we can move those to subsequent 90 days. But that's the essential idea.
Yeah, I like it. And obviously your book goes into a lot more detail, as well as your podcast as well. This, the conversations probably dive specific to certain sectors. It's going to be different, isn't it? Different types of businesses, different types of business owners as well, different motivations. And therefore you're going to find different case studies that match for different people. So I think that's probably a good, hearing people's stories is probably one of the most powerful ways to learn, isn't it?
And that's what we're trying to do. That is what we're trying to do with ScaleUp Radio. So one of the difficulties that I had when I came out of the corporate environment, and I had set up 3 or 4 of my own businesses at that point, but when I started talking to other business owners, within that 96%, if you like, it's talking in a language that resonates to them, that it is really important. We don't want to get too theoretical. So it is about the stories and the practical applications of what we're talking about. So, I don't want to give the impression that the book is an academic thesis on how you need to scale up. It's full of practical tips. It's based on what we've learned and seen with working with business owners. And that's what the podcast ScaleUp Radio is all about, then those real life stories. And those also come from the fact that part of the way that we work, and I think this is something as well that people listening should really think about. If they're not part of a peer group of some sort, then they should seriously think about that. And it's one of the ways that we work with business owners is putting people into close-knit groups of trusted people together. They work together, so 5 or 6 in a group, and we meet monthly, because then you've got that sounding board, but you've also got the practical experiences then of going, okay, well, we know that we need to be doing this business rhythm thing, but my business is different from yours, isn't it? So how does that work for me? What do I need to think about? And equally, people saying, you know what, that wouldn't work in I couldn't do that. That wouldn't work in my sector. And somebody else from a different sector going, well, we thought that actually in our sector a little while ago. And then we found that actually it does if we do it this way. Or equally, we learned by our mistakes in this way. So whatever you do, don't do this. And I think that sounding board is another thing that most business owners are missing. It's that we think we've got to do it all ourselves. Because and by the fact that we're entrepreneurial, we're self-starters, and we think we should be able to know all the answers ourselves. Whereas actually, we can benefit from a sounding board with other people. It also can really help with that inspiration, because you see a bit of success with and almost that inspiration and competition going a little bit with it, with the drive each other a little bit forward. So, the two sort of things that I talk about in the book is that separate those that succeed from those that don't. Is one is working to a system to scale up, so you actually understand it, and the rhythm is part of that system, and the 4 pillars of scaling up is part of that. But then working with a close, trusted group of peers, so that you've got that constant sounding board and built on experience. And as I say, it's not all about the theory; it's very much about those stories.
I can't overestimate the importance of the last point for business owners, and something I've learned myself the hard way, for sure. You mentioned that you go into business because we believe we can do all this ourselves. And a little bit of it is scared to ask for help, scared to be vulnerable and say, I don't know. And then maybe thinking, because you spend all your time talking to clients, talking to team, talking to, everybody in your industry, that you probably think that you're actually quite well served by opinions. But actually, being a business owner, even with a partner, it can be quite lonely. Depending on the relationship with your partner, you may have a partner that just agrees with everything that you do. That's, that's sort of the yin yang. If you're a very strong, dominant personality, you may get a partner that feels very comfortable just let you making all the decisions. And that can turn out quite badly if you don't have that kind of sounding board. So I think these are really important. I feel, Kevin, so many business owners are very good at certain things. Yeah. And they may be very good at being creative. They may be very good at sales. They may be very good at systems. And that is the ingredient for scaling up a business. They've got that passion and that drive and that, that sort of spike that makes them different to the average, salaried employee, right? It means that this is the right person to drive this thing. However, they all have blind spots, which can derail the whole thing. It's kind of like, this guy is a great pilot. He's the most acrobatic pilot, but he has this habit of just kind of running it below 100 feet, and like crashing the plane. You only need to crash the plane once and you're done. all that skill is out the window, right? So I think
unless you're Tom Cruise, he does seem to manage to.
Well, he's an exception. I don't think many of us are like Tom Cruise. We're kind of like a bit sort of a level down from him. But I think that's kind of where we are as business owners, isn't it? We just kind of remove these blind spots. We need these sounding boards, you call them smart boards, right?
We do.
I'm curious, what have you observed from those? I mean, obviously you're not going to share examples, like distinct examples, because it's all sort of behind closed doors. But, what have you seen in terms of the evolution of business owners in those smart boards? How did they sort of go into it? What do they kind of learn? What are the sort of takeaways for you?
Yeah, I think it is really interesting because, I think initially many people, especially if you haven't experienced working with other people in a peer group, you think, what am I going to get out of this? What is it? But as soon as you experience it and you start to see what comes out of it, you realize the power of it, because you can short circuit so many things. And what we do is everybody comes with a little update each month. So it's part of their business rhythm, actually, is, have they done what they said they were going to do? And there's that bit of accountability within the group. But they also come, and we also look at a theme each time. So we look at a business improvement thing, and we explore that between us as to how the relevance of that is within each of us. But most importantly, everybody brings a challenge each month. And that challenge and those can vary from being quite tactical. We've had it, for example, I'm answering emails at 12 o'clock at night and I don't want to be, right? How do I do that? It's a very tactical, right the way through to some really strategic things like, I'm looking for that next stage of growth. Should I do it organically or should I do it by acquisition, right? Well, in a short discussion, you're not going to answer everything about should I grow by acquisition or organically. But what you can do is you can synthesize the next steps based on experience, and people can then help you to focus and go, right, this is the next bit that you should do. And that gets you kickstarted, as opposed to what can often happen. And I know I've been guilty of this in the past. If I'm not quite sure what the right direction is to go with something, I spin my wheels, and I go around in my head. And because there's never, well, with complex things, there's normally not a black and white answer, right? So I'm forever going, oh, well, hang on, if I did this, well, on the other hand, though, if I did that. Whereas if you've got a group of people that can, between them, help you to get to what it is that's causing you to spin your wheels and give you that, right, that's the next step to do, then you're off. So you short circuit a lot of the questions that you might have. You get to answers quickly, and you move forwards.
Yeah, extremely valuable. I can even think of an example right here, right now for me, where I would think, actually, I need an answer to this question.
Yeah.
For example, how do I set up an outpost, a franchise, or a subsidiary in, for example, the UK or the US? Or I can talk to a lot of people and they can give me advice and their thoughts on it. But what I need somebody is to say, yeah, I've done franchising before, but listen, Graham, this is like, save yourself the time and the heartache. Do it this way. Hire somebody locally. Find a local investor, etc. You need somebody to say, I've done this, and I made my mistakes. And you could spend a lifetime spinning wheels getting answers, right?
You can. So sometimes you will have somebody that absolutely has done exactly what it is that you're trying to do, and they can give you advice from that direct experience. In other cases, it might be that even if somebody within the group hasn't got that direct knowledge, they can help you in your thinking to get to that next step. So it's not always about, because to cover every aspect of every question that somebody might have, you might, in every industry, you might need a very big group to do that. But normally people will have some input and good advice as to how to overcome that next roadblock to get you moving. And it might simply be a case of, actually, I know somebody that maybe they're not part of this group, but I know somebody that can help you with this. Or your next step would be to research this in a bit more, and here's some pointers as to where you might go to research and come back to the group with what you found from that aspect. So that's all. Yeah, that's all a key part of it. So there are things that come up within the groups that are applicable to every business, because at the end of the day, we're all growing businesses, and regardless of what sectors we're in, we come across similar challenges and headaches. But there are also some things that then are a bit more industry specific, and it might then require that specific industry knowledge.
Great. Let's talk about some resources, rounding up for business owners listening who would be curious about finding out more. Obviously, your smart boards books as well. Your book, Entrpreneurial ScaleUp System. Let's give the shout out, credit where credit's due, so people can find out about the system. Everything we've really talked about today was just skimming the surface. It's very practical, very laid out. It's not, like you say, academic. It's very much in sort of a prescriptive format. This is what you need to do. I think that will appeal to a lot of business owners who probably want some hard advice. Like, this is what you do. Step 1, do this.
Yep.
And also your pillars of scale up. But you how do you term them in the book? It's the pillars of growth, or what do you call it in the book? Just so people can understand what they're.
Well, the scale-up journey, if you're meaning about the different milestones, and we typically look at that around the numbers of people within the business, and it's this idea of when we're scaling up, it's not just a straight line growth or even a sort of wiggly line growth. It's a series of stepping stones, and there's ladders of success, if you like, against each of those stepping stones. And typically, they're in terms of the numbers of employees that we've got. So if we just want to build a one-man band consulting type business, that's the first kind of stepping stone, if you like, and the ladder. And we can build a really successful business that's a consulting business that just keeps us earning a decent amount of money potentially. But if we want to build a business that's maybe got a team of 3 to 5 people, which is the next one, that's a different ladder. It's a different kind of business, and we've got to think about how the business is different at that point. And that's when the pillars come in. We've got to think about strategy, we've got to think about the people, we've got to think about the way we execute it, and we've got to think about the cash. So what's needed in each of those to get cleanly, if you like, smoothly from one stepping stone to the next, and avoid what we term as the valleys of death in between. And there's stepping stones all the way along this. So 3 to 5 employees is the first obvious next one. Then it's typically 8 to 12 when we got a team that's big enough then really to be not reliant on any one individual, but we're just about maxing out there as what one of us as a founder and leader of the business can cope with. Much beyond there, and we start to really struggle without having a senior leadership team to help to spread the load. And that's the next stepping stone, is when we've got 20 to 25 people, and that's quite a big jump at that point. And that's the one typically the 96% of businesses don't manage to make, because we've created a comfortable business probably at 8 to 12 people. It might be £1 million turnover or something in that level. The next one requires a bit more investment, and our risk appetite has probably gone down as an entrepreneur because we've already created a lifestyle now at that business. We've got a reasonably successful business, and now we're going to say we've got to go again. We've got to invest back in the business. We've got to go through another period of maybe this valley beforehand before it gets good again. Do I really want it? And how do I do it? And that's part of this thinking, as to thinking in that way as these stepping stones, and thinking what has to happen different in the business for me to get from one to the next. So that's the way we talk about this scale up journey, and those series of stepping stones with a ladder of success on each one. And you generally can't just hop from one ladder to the next ladder at the same level. You have to come down a rung or two and rebuild, which is why you've got this valley in between. And if we get it wrong, that's when we get stuck with all of the symptoms that most business owners come to us with, which is, I don't have enough time in the day. I've got people problems. They're not doing what I want them to do. And I'm getting all the hassle from the people. And I'm running out of cash. There seems to be money, seems to be growing, but actually we're not getting cash coming out. Those are the symptoms that people come with. But if we just address an individual symptom and don't think about the system as a whole, then we're just going to temporarily fix that symptom, but it's going to come back again. And that's the difference between growth and scaling up, is if we just grow a business like that, we grow the problems and the headaches with it as well.
That's very real. And many businesses, those are a number of those 96% that never make it to the 10 plus. So that's all mapped out for you, your flight plan in the Entrpreneurial ScaleUp System. Thanks for sharing that. I really like the idea of what you're doing, breaking it down, because generally a lot of business advice tends to be vanilla. It tends to be treating business as if it was one entity. And, it may be sort of top level mindset advice, or it may be specific to, technical or tactical advice, how to generate leads and so on. But what you've done, and it's the first time I've really seen this, is like you've broken down the journey of a business, because they are very different, year 1, year 2, year 3. And this has been reconfirmed by my own experience in the current business, which is 4 years old, is that each stage is very different. It requires a different mindset, a different set of tools, a different set of dashboards that you need, things that you need to monitor, different teams, etc. You need to get to each and every stage. And that's the reality, is that you need some kind of reference point to tell you, actually, you're entering stage 3 or whatever it may be. And therefore you need to start making plans to change and adapt, because, the rules have changed here slightly. And I guess that's kind of the useful aspect of having that mapped out for you in the book. So that sounds very interesting to any business owner out there, to have some kind of playbook, if you like, for your business.
And that's actually what inspired me to write it. Is I specifically remember somebody we were working with. In fact, they weren't a client at the time. They'd got about 16 employees, and they were stuck in one of these valleys, essentially. And the comment was, no, there's no instruction manual. Nobody's written an instruction manual as to how to scale a business. And it's like, okay, well, hang on, maybe that's what we should be looking at doing.
Nice, yeah. Or you can find out the hard way.
Yes, and that's
what most people do, right? Yeah. I mean, I think people like the challenge of doing that, but you can enjoy the challenge and get a bit of help along the way.
So you can imagine the power then of understanding some of those things, but then working with a small group of people that maybe are at different stages of that scale up journey. So you've got somebody that has made that transition to 20, 25 people, and you're trying to make that transition. And equally, you might have somebody that's still at the 3 to 5 level in your group, and you're then sharing the real experiences of overcoming those challenges.
It's Kevin Brent, everybody, author and podcast host. You go and check out his book, The Entrepreneurial ScaleUp System, as well as the podcast, ScaleUp Radio. Kevin, just in signing off, I know we've mentioned, for example, Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I think is a great recommendation to anybody, not just business owners. Certainly helps for business owners, but even that advice of start with the end in mind. I think we've kind of started with that today. What do you want to achieve in your business? What other books would you recommend or resources, particularly for business owners, apart from your own? That's excluded.
Of course. Thank you.
What would you recommend?
I love Built to Sell by John Warrillow. I think that's a really, really good one. It's not all necessarily about building a business that you have to sell, but it's about building a business that will build value. There's obviously the E-Myth. Michael Gerber is a really good standard text around here. Scaling Up by Vern Harnish is also really, really good one. And one that I also particularly like, a bit more mathematical in a way, but really good, but around the cash, is Profit First by Mike Michalowicz. All really good books, and a number of those principles we adopt within the system.
Kevin, signing off, call sign. Where do the listeners go and find out more about you? If they want to obviously go to Amazon and check out the book, we'll put the details in the show notes, link to your podcast as well. Where is the best jumping off point for all your projects?
I think you can certainly look for ScaleUp Radio as the podcast. That's a really good point. And if you want to find out more about the book, then you can just type in the Entrepreneurial ScaleUp System on Amazon. Or if you want to find our website about it, then just go to www.theesisgroup.co.uk.
Excellent.
And that's
Kevin.
ESUS.
ESUS. Got it. We'll put it in the show notes. Kevin, thanks for joining us today. Really enjoyed the conversation, enlightening as well. And thanks for sharing some of your insights and journey with the listeners today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for having me on, Graham.